Thank you very much, and I can tell that the microphone is working, which is always a big relief. I had no idea what the Provost was going to say before me, but we do quite a lot of serendipity around here. And in a way, what I'm going to talk about in terms of creativity could be called the arts of luck. And I'm very glad to learn of the words Introduction to English via Horace Walpole, who is one of the great characters of culture, really, in the 18th century. Horace Walpole had a political career in the UK, but is nowadays known for being one of the first writers of the modern ghost story. He published a novel called The Castle of Otranto, which is crazy, about a ghost and a castle in Europe, because obviously bad stuff happens in Europe. The English adored it, and it kind of became the pioneer of what we now call Gothic literature, which is literature devoted to those parts of the human psyche that are less conscious, less rational, less respectable, exactly what we consider today by the unconscious. And in many ways, Walpole is one of the ancestors of depth psychology. There's a very interesting collection of essays came out about 10 years ago about the work of Sigmund Freud, and particularly his first great book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And most of the essays were by literary scholars, and they pointed out at the end of the book that basically The Interpretation of Dreams is a novel. It's a Gothic novel.
I love that.
And what is most Gothic about it is that it's not recognised as a novel by the culture. And that kind of expresses something of the newness and radical edge of depth psychology. But my title is The Necessity of Creativity. And I want to just pause for a second on that very familiar word, creativity, because it is a very familiar word. It's used a lot in our culture. We're all encouraged to be creative, to help our children to be creative, to make our professional life creative. Business and industry needs to be more creative. The word is used a lot and somewhat overused, and I think to a certain extent it's kind of losing some of its energy, some of the kind of energy that we want to pause a while and see if we can put back, rather like Joe just put back the energy in the word luck. So creativity in a depth psychology sense is a big deal. It is about making new, about really a revolutionary change, the ability to make a new expression, make a new life, and to help others around us to make new. And to go very simply into the depth psychology perspective on creativity, I'm going to use a very small and one of my favourite quotes from C.G. Jung. He said, "I am stuck is the theme of fairy tale and myth. It is also what everybody says who comes into psychotherapy." And that sums up an awful lot about depth psychology, that we're doing in this term depth psychology something that in some ways has been in the culture forever. I mean, if it's true of the human soul, then it's not been invented in the 19th century. What comes in the 19th century is a new way to harness the resources of the creative soul, because it's needed, because the culture by the 19th century had lost certain capacities, was no longer adequately tending to the soul, tending to the psyche, the whole psyche. And so there was a desperate need to reconfigure how the soul might be tended in the modern age. And psychology itself, and then depth psychology, becomes something radically new, but dealing with issues and resources that have always been with us. And being able to recognise in things like philosophy, mythology, literature, and the arts, that there are psychological energies there that are necessary. We still live in a culture that sees creativity, particularly in the material forms of the arts and the humanities, as something nice to do at the weekend. This is a culture that has an epidemic of mental illness. 1 in 4 people in the United Kingdom and in the United States will have some kind of psychological diagnosis, and that's only the people who can get to or who can afford a doctor. We are in a culture with great distress, and this is something to do with our modern life, the modern world that has been built in the last few centuries and that has accelerated its effects on us in the last few decades. And depth psychology is deeply relevant because it is addressing how we need to live now, and how we need to help the world now, and how we need to contribute now. The problem that depth psychology and its creativity addresses is marginalisation, that we've, as a culture, as a Western culture, that we have progressively narrowed our focus and marginalised creativity, the creativity of the imagination. We've marginalised nature, and now we're kind of seeing the consequences of that. And we've marginalised the feminine, we've marginalised the body, and as part of that, that has fed into more unjust marginalisations of the way in which different ethnicities, different races have been treated in the past few centuries. This is all part of this repression of creativity, this repression of something that is other. Because on a very personal level, the other are those parts of ourselves that we're not in full control of. So the other is our dream world, that we're not in control of our dreams. Sometimes our dreams are pleasant experiences, sometimes they're not, but we can't fully predict, we can't fully control. So within ourselves, there are energies that we can't control in the way in which our culture has imagined that it can control everything, that we can control nature, that we can control people, and that's okay. It's not okay. The culture of control has failed. It's failing us in a very big level when it comes to climate change, but it's also failing us on a very individual level. So I can give an example, a true example. In my own family, there is a very beautiful, talented teenager. And she has a loving home, 2 wonderful parents. She has a terrific education that her parents are able to pay for. She has everything, and she's bright and she's very successful. She's developed an eating disorder, and her school, which is a very good school, has recognised and has said to her parents she's trying to be in control, and she's showing anxiety because she can't control everything around her, including her own feelings, her own fears. And one of the things that we've been trying to do for her is to say it's not about being in control, it's about being safe. And being safe is knowing that you've got people who are there for you, is knowing that the things that frighten you are not necessarily your enemies, your own fears about your future, for example, your own fears about the planet, that these energies that are distressing are also energies that you can have a relationship with, that you can work with, and that ultimately you're going to be stronger for them. Now this is somebody in a very kind of privileged situation, but it kind of mirrors the problem of a world that has tried to shunt off the creative imagination to the side of existence, has marginalised it. Because I very much feel, and having worked with depth psychology for 30 years, I very much feel that what is most innate to depth psychology is that it is the psychology of the creative imagination. And I see that perspective as the foundation of all of Pacifica's programs. That it is the thing that works. You know, it actually works, this depth psychology, and it works in the healing psychologies, the healing practices of the clinical programs, the counselling program, the 2 clinical PhD programs. And it's the creative imagination that works with the students on the other doctoral programs, the mythological program and the 4 depth psychology PhD programs, as students engage in creativity through their research and creativity in their research to produce something new, something different, and something that makes a difference. And in the MA Engaged Humanities, what I love about the program that I chair is that, on the one hand, I think it's unique in the world. There is nowhere else that is doing the psychology of the creative imagination, humanities material in the arts and philosophy and literature, and creative practice. And that combination of those 3 things is immensely powerful. And I see on that program every student going on a journey, and through that journey finding the sources of creativity within themselves. And because they found the sources of creativity within themselves, they are a different person at the end of it. They are stronger, they are confident, they have a community. One of the things that perhaps hasn't been said yet is that Pacifica is a very supportive, even nurturing environment, and students find a community through their experiences in all the programs. And that is certainly true of my experiences teaching on the 2 hybrid programs. People think online learning is dry, and I'm sure it can be, but our programs are online and a residential here on the campus. And the online part of the teaching and learning is fabulously exciting because everybody is so engaged invested because it's the psychology of the creative imagination. And if your creativity is engaged, then there is a wonderful energy that develops for the individual students, but also within the students. And right now I'm talking about both the MA Engaged Humanities and the PhD programme in Jungian and archetypal studies that are taught the same way, with this wonderful dynamic online environment, and then the residentials once a quarter here on campus. One of the things that I feel is at the root of creativity and why it's so important is a way I often talk about the unconscious to students who are not as advanced as yourselves. Once upon a time, 10 years ago and more, I taught at a university in London. I think you can tell that I'm not from around here. And I taught undergraduates. And I taught them literature, and I introduced them to depth psychology. And they were very, very, very ignorant, and they knew nothing about psychology. They barely knew the word. They did not know what the unconscious was supposed to be. So I used to say, the unconscious is that which defeats you. And they got it immediately. This was a university in which all the students were working class. Without exception, they were the first people in their universities, the first people in their families to go to university. They had very little confidence, they had no money, they had huge problems of divorce, violence in the families, sickness. They struggled. And to hear that the unconscious is that which defeats you, but that's not an end point, that's a beginning. We all get defeated by grief and loss and sickness. We are mortal. And it's also a very tough world. Maybe it's getting tougher at the moment. So this is a common experience. It's so un-American to talk about defeat. And I think that's one of the stresses of our current culture, that we're supposed to be winners. Loser has been tagged as a particularly bad word in the last few months. But the experience of being defeated is common, it's human, it's what brings us together, and it's a starting point. That only when we truly resonate with our defeat is there the possibility of the most powerful creativity of all, the ability to create a new life, a new direction, new ideas, new thoughts, new art. We all know, if we just take art for a moment, we all know the stories of the tortured artists. They are cliches, but there is something to that the great artists created amazing things, and their suffering was not, a problem for their creativity. Their suffering was at the heart of their creativity. And so depth psychology is hugely practical because it addresses the human condition and it faces things that often people don't want to face. And that's why there is a huge need for what we can bring to the world, whether students of Pacifica are going into the helping professions, or as many of them do, teaching professions, or a variety of creative practices, whether those are through a kind of business-oriented career or something more along the lines of the arts as we commonly think of them. The unconscious is that which defeats us. But from that, the most amazing creativity can emerge. I'm going to just talk for a few more minutes and then allow time for questions or comments from you. So just in case you feel that you'd like a break from being talked at, that break will come. So the creativity that is at the heart of all our depth programs happens at Pacifica in a number of levels. Nobody really graduates here without having undergone some transformation. This is transformative education. This is one of the things that makes Pacifica special and depth psychology special. And I think a lot of people come here looking for transformation and looking for a way to reorient their lives, as well as a way to reorient their careers. And it really happens. It really works. This doesn't mean that it's easy, but it is through the depth psychology that the psychological energies that we bring into the classroom start to connect and spark. And so it is the case that, as people say of things like complexity theory, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So you come here and obviously you have an individual path and you have an individual relationship with your creativity through whatever program it is, and you have a lot of choice about where you take your creativity, and you choose what research that you do. But you're also part of something greater than yourself in a way that's very visible and a way that is very generative. And it is true that people make lifelong connections and friendships here. And I can see it particularly, I've seen it in all the programs, and I've taught on most of them. But for example, in the MA Engaged Humanities, students who have come in at different times to the program have met each other and engaged in collaborative, creative projects that they would never have been able to do if they'd just been at home kind of working on their own. So creativity is finding a personal relationship and finding something larger through the actual processes of being in a class at Pacifica. But as I was saying earlier, this creativity becomes the heart of whatever professional path that you are then going on to take. And I want to just touch on perhaps again, but say a little more about these kind of much bigger issues that we face and that are perhaps currently feel like they're defeating us. So climate change is huge and extremely frightening, and I think a lot of the time we can't even bear to think about it because it seems like as individuals we can't do anything. But the sense that depth psychology's creativity comes from the tackling of marginalisation that is at the root of the problem of climate change. The problem of climate change is that we built a world that assumed that nature was just going to be there, whatever we did to it. And that it was a kind of endless good mother that would take whatever kind of brickbats and poison and pollution that was thrown, and you could throw things away into this wonderful, bountiful nature, and she'd keep on giving back in the ways that we needed. Well, that hasn't worked. We've repressed nature by repressing parts of our own psyche. That is the structure that by becoming a culture of repression of things like our creative potentials, we have repressed and ignored the creativity of nature. And that has caused a lot of where we're at with these huge problems. So, by looking at how we got to where we are, it is possible to have a kind of creative rethinking of our relationship with non-human nature. And I think this is becoming more and more a part of what we do here at Pacifica, that in the sense in which we are cherishing the human nature of our unknown parts of ourselves, that we are finding ways of reconnecting and cherishing the non-human nature. So, depth psychology has this fundamental creativity that is fundamentally powerful and practical, and can be used, is being used by our students in all sorts of fields, including the eco-psychological, including trying to bring social justice to where it has been denied, because we are looking at those repressions that we've made and trying to understand how it is we can become more whole, how it is that we can be a more creative society that can welcome difference and otherness and different energies, whether they be from different kinds of human cultures or different kinds of artistic and creative ventures or different kinds of living beings, so that the community isn't just a human community, but it's a planetary community. I'm going to make a last point. In depth psychology, we see creativity being expressed in images, and images are the language of our dreams. But images are how the creative imagination communicates with us in images. They may be bodily images, they may be visual images, they may be sound images, and they may be word images. These images, once they're infused with the psyche beyond our rational ego, these images can never be fully known or understood. They have a numinous power. And although they have some meaning-making capacity, that meaning has to be a large meaning, an inclusive meaning. But images, real images that are suffused with the unconscious psyche, are precise. They're not wholly rational, therefore they're not wholly knowable, but they are precise. There's a lesson here about language, that to be whole, we need to be very precise in our language, and my students get totally fed up with me telling them to be precise in their posts and the online work. Precise does not mean limited to the ego. I think today, shall we say since November, we have an issue with language in our political sphere, and a problem with very imprecise language. Language that is not the preciseness of wholeness, the preciseness of numinosity. It's imprecise, it's disconnected from the psyche, and even in our kind of media discourse, it's more and more being recognised as a real problem. Depth psychology addresses this. It really is a kind of practical and urgent way of going deeper, understanding, and becoming the kind of creative person who can not only manage the sheer difficulties of the 21st century, but who can give back and have a creative response to what we face. Thank you.